Redditor 1. The ocean at night is a world of its own. It stretches out infinitely in all directions, dark and unknowable, the faint glow of moonlight glinting off the rolling waves. I was working on a commercial fishing boat at the time, a job I'd taken for the money and the adventure, though mostly the money. We were out in open water, miles from land, the engines humming steadily as we hauled in the latest catch. The air smelled of salt and fish, the deck slick with seawater. It was a routine night, or at least it started that way. There was another boat nearby, part of our small fleet, its lights faint but visible in the distance. We'd been communicating over the radio, swapping updates on our progress and keeping each other company in the isolation of the open sea. The work was steady, monotonous. I was on deck, checking the nets and tying off lines, when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a plane, 3 bright lights in a triangular pattern moving steadily across the sky. But as I watched, it became clear that this wasn't a plane. The lights weren't blinking and they weren't casting any beams onto the water. They were blindingly bright when I looked directly at them, but their glow didn't illuminate the deck or the surrounding water. It was as if they existed in isolation, their light contained, unnatural. I shouted to the rest of the crew, pointing upward, and the deckhand closest to me stopped what he was doing, his face twisting in confusion as he followed my gaze. The lights were descending, slow and deliberate, and I realized with a jolt that whatever this thing was, it wasn't in the sky. It was coming toward us. "Hey, you seeing this?" I yelled over the engine noise, but my voice was thin, almost drowned out by the rush of my own pulse in my ears. The other boat must have noticed it too, because their spotlight swung up, sweeping across the darkness, though it didn't catch anything but empty sky. The object stopped about 10 feet above the deck, silent and impossibly close. The triangular pattern of lights was now clearly visible, and I could make out the shape of the craft itself, about the size of a car, its edges smooth and dark against the night. It hovered there, motionless, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. There was no sound, no hum, no whir of engines, nothing. Just the steady, oppressive brightness of the lights and the eerie stillness of the craft. I couldn't look away, even though it hurt my eyes. The lights were so bright they should have illuminated everything, but the deck remained dark, the shadows deep and undisturbed. It was as if the light didn't behave the way light was supposed to. I glanced at the others, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but their expressions mirrored my own. Confusion, awe, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it moved. The craft shifted slightly, tilting as if observing us, though I couldn't see any windows or markings. It followed the boat, maintaining its position just above the deck. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. What was it? Why was it here? And then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished. One moment it was there, solid and undeniable, and the next it was gone. There was no sound, no flash, no indication of where it had gone. It just disappeared, leaving us staring at the empty sky in stunned silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic crash of the waves against the hull and the distant hum of the other boat's engine. Finally, someone broke the silence. What the hell was that? I didn't have an answer. None of us did. The radio crackled to life, the crew on the other boat calling to ask if we'd seen what they had. Their voices were shaky, nervous, confirming that the object had hovered over their boat first, before moving on to ours. They described it exactly as we had. 3 lights in a triangular pattern, silent, impossibly bright but casting no light. And we spent the rest of the night talking about it, going over every detail, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Was it military? Some kind of experimental craft? But why would something like that be out here, in the middle of nowhere, following a couple of fishing boats? And how could it vanish like that, without a trace? The next day, we tried to put it behind us, but it lingered in the back of our minds, an unspoken weight. No one else believed us when we got back to shore. The story was met with skeptical laughs, dismissive comments about too much rum, or jokes about aliens. But I knew what I'd seen. We all did. Years later, I still think about that night. I've read about other sightings, descriptions that match what we saw almost exactly, and it sends a shiver down my spine every time. Whatever it wasn't something I could explain, and it wasn't something I'll ever forget. Redditor 2. The canoeing trip was supposed to be an adventure, a 4-day escape from the dullness of everyday life. We were a group of young teens full of energy and unbridled enthusiasm, ready to conquer the wilderness. The southeast United States is full of remote rivers and dense forests, places where you can paddle for miles and feel completely cut off from the rest of the world. That was the draw. No phones, no cars, no responsibilities, just us, the river, and the trees. The first few days passed in a blur of laughter, paddling, and the occasional mishap as one of us tipped a canoe or lost a sandal in the muck. By the third night, we were deep in the wild, miles from any sign of civilization. We'd set up camp on a sandy bank along the river, building a fire that roared into the night, its orange glow casting flickering shadows across the trees. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of the river and the forest. We were loud, like teenage boys tend to be, shouting and laughing as we goofed off around the bonfire. Someone had brought marshmallows, and we roasted them until they turned to blackened, gooey blobs. As the hours wore on, the fire died down to a bed of glowing coals, and the excitement gave way to quieter conversation. We sat in a circle, talking about nothing in particular, the kind of meandering topics that seem profound at that age. That's when we heard it. A scream, distant but sharp, cutting through the stillness of the night. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect from a person. It was too high-pitched, too drawn out. It sounded almost animal, but not quite. The conversation died instantly, and we all sat there frozen, straining to hear more. The sound sent a chill through me, the kind that starts in your spine and spreads outward, making your skin crawl. "What was that?" one of my friends whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. None of us had an answer. We exchanged uneasy glances, trying to laugh it off. "Probably just a bird," someone said, though it didn't sound convincing. After a while, the tension eased, and we went back to talking, though our voices were quieter now, the earlier energy drained by the unsettling sound. Maybe an hour later, one of my friends suddenly pointed to the opposite bank of the river. "Guys," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "what is that?" We all turned to look, and my heart nearly stopped. There, standing among the trees on the far side of the river, was a massive figure. It was faint, barely visible in the dim light, but the full moon was bright enough to illuminate its silhouette. It stood perfectly still, partially obscured by the dense branches, its shape towering over the underbrush. For a moment, none of us moved or spoke. We just stared, our minds scrambling to make sense of what we were seeing. It was huge, easily taller than any of us, with broad shoulders and long limbs. It didn't move, but there was something about the way it stood there, watching us, that made my stomach churn. It didn't feel like we were looking at an animal. It felt deliberate, like it was aware of us, observing. What do we do?" one of my friends stammered, his voice trembling. "Get my dad," another whispered. We backed away slowly, our eyes never leaving the figure, and stumbled back to the tents where our friend's dad was already asleep. We shook him awake, our words tumbling over each other as we tried to explain what we'd seen. He looked skeptical, but grabbed a flashlight and followed us back to the riverbank. When we got there, the figure was still standing in the same spot, its silhouette barely visible through the trees. My friend's dad clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness and landing on the figure. The light didn't illuminate it fully, but it was enough to make out more detail. Its eyes reflected the beam, glowing a faint red in the darkness, like a predator caught in headlights. The sight sent a wave of terror through me, my legs trembling as I fought the urge to run. "It's probably just an animal," the dad said, though his tone lacked conviction. "A bear, maybe. Or a trick of the light." But it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that, perfectly still, watching, their eyes gleaming like embers in the night. We stayed there for what felt like an eternity, watching it as it watched us. Eventually, it moved, slowly at first. It turned and began walking along the embankment, its movements smooth and deliberate. The ground beneath it seemed to tremble slightly with each step, the faint sound of its heavy footfalls reaching us across the water. It reached a spot where the embankment sloped upward and disappeared into the trees. We waited, holding our breath, but it didn't reappear. The woods were silent again, the air heavy with the lingering sense of something wrong. None of us slept that night. We huddled by the fire, our eyes darting to the shadows, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending a jolt of fear through us. My friend's dad tried to reassure us, but even he seemed uneasy, his flashlight clutched tightly in his hand. The next morning, the woods seemed normal again. The sunlight filtered through the trees, the river sparkled, and the air was filled with the chirping of birds. It was hard to believe that anything had happened at all, but when we looked across the river, we saw footprints in the mud along the embankment. Huge, deep impressions that didn't belong to any animal we knew. We packed up camp early, none of us wanting to stay another night. We didn't talk much as we paddled down the river, the memory of the figure still fresh in our minds. More than a decade later, I still think about that night. We don't talk about it often, and when we do, it's in hushed tones, as if speaking about it too loudly might bring it back. I don't know what we saw, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that it was watching us, and for a brief moment, we were part of a world far stranger and darker than the one we thought we knew. Redditor 3. When I was little, the cabin on the lake in rural Appalachia felt like the edge of the world. It was a place of stillness and simplicity, where the water stretched out like glass and the dense woods seemed to hum with life. The cabin wasn't luxurious, but it was ours, a refuge from the noise and chaos of daily life. My parents loved it, and my sister and I grew up roaming the woods, playing by the shore, and chasing fireflies in the evenings. One of our favorite things to do was pack up a picnic and head to a large field near the cabin, where we'd spend lazy afternoons eating, laughing, and basking in the sun. The field bordered a steep hill that rolled down to meet the dense tree line of the forest below. I was too young to remember much about what happened that day, but my family never forgot it. It started as any other picnic. The blanket was spread out, the basket unpacked, and the sound of birdsong mingled with the occasional rustle of the breeze through the grass. My sister and I were playing nearby while my parents relaxed, enjoying the tranquility of the moment. But then my dad froze, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something far off. A loud, rhythmic banging echoed through the field, coming from the bottom of the hill. It wasn't a sound we'd heard before, not the sharp crack of a branch snapping or the dull thud of something falling. It was deliberate, forceful, and loud enough to carry up the hill. My dad stood up, his expression tense, and walked to the crest of the hill to get a better look. What he saw froze him in his tracks. Standing at the bottom of the hill, just where the field met the tree line, was an enormous figure covered in thick white fur. It stood on two legs, its massive frame dwarfing the surrounding bushes. In its hands, it held a large log, which it was hurling over its head with terrifying force. The log smashed against the trees with a deafening crack, the sound reverberating through the woods. My dad waved my mom over and she joined him at the hilltop. She later described the same thing, a towering bipedal creature, its white fur catching the dappled sunlight as it continued its strange, methodical activity. Neither of them spoke for a moment, stunned by what they were seeing. "We need to go," my dad said finally, his voice low and steady. They didn't waste time. My parents called us over, hurriedly packed up the picnic, and we made our way back to the cabin. My sister and I didn't understand what was going on, but the tension in the air was palpable. My parents weren't the kind of people to spook easily, but whatever they'd seen that day had left them visibly shaken. For years, they rarely spoke about it. My dad, a practical, no-nonsense man, didn't want to be labeled as the guy who saw Bigfoot. My mom agreed, dismissing the experience as weird, but not worth dwelling on. Even so, I could tell it lingered in their minds, an unanswered question that neither of them could quite shake. It wasn't until years later, during a family Christmas gathering, that the memory resurfaced. We were sitting around the living room swapping stories about the cabin and our time there. My aunt, who also owned a cabin on the same lake, leaned forward and said, "I have the strangest story about that place. I've never told anyone but your uncle." She went on to describe a day in the late 1980s when she'd gone out to pick blackberries near the edge of the forest. She'd spotted what she thought was a bear in the distance, its shape partially obscured by the bushes. Nervous but unwilling to leave the berries, she kept an eye on it as she worked. "I thought it was a bear," she said, until it stood up. The room went silent. She described how the creature rose to its full height, its thick white fur gleaming in the sunlight. It wasn't a bear. It was taller, broader, and unmistakably walking on two legs. She watched in stunned silence as it turned and disappeared into the woods, moving with a grace that seemed at odds with its massive size. When she finished, my parents exchanged a glance, and my mom broke the silence. "We saw it too," she said quietly. They shared their story about the creature at the bottom of the hill, and the realization dawned on all of us. They'd seen the same thing. Both encounters had happened around the same time in the same area, and the descriptions matched perfectly. The white fur, the bipedal stance, the sheer size. It was all too similar to dismiss. Curious, I started digging into local legends and reports. It turned out that sightings of a large white-furred creature had been reported in the region during the late 1980s. Some people were convinced it was a Bigfoot, describing encounters eerily similar to what my family had experienced. One man was so certain of what he'd seen that he dedicated his life to finding the creature again. According to his accounts, he claimed to have found evidence of 3 creatures, 2 brown and 1 white, matching the descriptions given by other witnesses. I don't know what to think. The rational part of me wants to believe it was just a bear, or maybe some kind of trick of the light, but the way my parents and aunt describe their experiences makes it hard to dismiss. They're not the kind of people to jump to conclusions or embellish stories, and the fear in their voices when they talk about it is real. Whatever it was, it left an indelible mark on our family. The cabin, once a place of pure comfort and joy, now carries an undercurrent of mystery, a reminder of the strange and unexplainable. I've been back a few times since, but I can't walk through the woods without looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a flash of white fur between the trees. Whether it was a bear, a Bigfoot, or something else entirely, I may never know. But one thing is certain, the memory of that day and the questions it raised will stay with us forever. Redditor 4. I've never been the kind of person who tells stories like this. In fact, I've kept this buried for most of my life, sharing it only with the 2 friends who were there that night. Even then, we didn't really talk about it afterward. It was like an unspoken rule, a pact forged in the eerie silence of that night. It was the summer before 8th grade, one of those hot, humid nights where sleep felt impossible. The air smelled of grass and asphalt, the faint chirping of crickets filling the stillness. I'd convinced my parents I was sleeping over at my friend Danny's house, and Danny had told his parents the same about me. It wasn't unusual. We were always scheming back then, and this night was no different. We had plans: sneak out at midnight, roam the neighborhood, and maybe, if we were feeling bold enough, visit a group of girls having a sleepover a few blocks away. Around midnight, Danny, our friend Marcus, and I slipped out of the house. We kept to the sidewalks, our voices hushed as we moved through the quiet streets. It was thrilling in a way only a 13-year-old could understand. The sense of freedom mingled with the mild fear of getting caught. The neighborhood was a typical suburban sprawl, well-lit streets lined with neat rows of houses, most of them dark as their occupants slept. As we turned a corner onto a wider street, I noticed something strange. The usual sky full of stars and the occasional airplane was obscured. Instead, there was a massive, dark shape hanging in the air above us, blotting out the night sky like an enormous shadow. I stopped dead in my tracks, grabbing Danny's arm. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. All 3 of us stared upward, our necks craned, and the air seemed to grow heavier. The thing was massive, easily the size of 4 or 5 football fields. Its shape was unlike anything I'd ever seen, long and blimp-like, but sleek, polished, almost like black gunmetal. There were no lights, no sound, no markings. It just hovered there, impossibly close, as if watching us. "Do you see it?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. We all mumbled our agreement, each of us frozen in place. The silence was oppressive, like the world had stopped to accommodate this impossibility. I couldn't move, couldn't think, my mind looping over the same question. What am I looking at? We whispered to each other, trying to rationalize what we were seeing. A government experiment, a secret military craft. None of it made sense. This thing was too big, too silent, too otherworldly. And then something happened, a sudden lapse in my memory, like a skipped frame in a film reel. One moment we were standing there staring at the enormous craft, and the next it was gone. I don't mean it drifted away or faded into the distance. It vanished as if it had never been there at all. In its place was a small object, high in the sky, glowing faintly. It looked like a tiny white barbell, falling slowly toward the earth. Wisps of smoke trailed from it, twisting and dissipating in the air. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread, as though the craft's disappearance should have been comforting, but wasn't. Then came the trucks. 2 black pickup trucks appeared from nowhere, tearing down the street at an alarming speed. Their engines roared and their headlights pierced the darkness as they sped past us, ignoring the 25-amp residential limit entirely. The trucks looked brand new, with silver toolboxes gleaming in the moonlight. They didn't stop, didn't slow down, just barreled forward as if chasing something invisible. "What the hell is going on?" Danny muttered, his voice trembling. None of us answered. We stood there for what felt like an eternity before finally heading back to Danny's house. By the time we got there, the first rays of sunlight were breaking over the horizon. We were exhausted, our minds racing, but none of us wanted to talk about what we'd seen. Instead, we collapsed onto the floor in Danny's room and tried to sleep. The next morning, we made a pact to tell Danny's dad. He worked for the city, and we figured he might know something. Maybe it was some kind of city project, or he'd heard about a military exercise in the area. But when morning came, none of us followed through. It was as if the words were caught in our throats, like speaking them aloud would make the memory more real, more terrifying. The years passed, and life went on. Marcus moved away, and Danny and I drifted apart, though we stayed loosely connected through social media. We never spoke about that night again. It wasn't a conscious decision. There was just this unspoken understanding that it was better left untouched. Every now and then I'd think about it, wondering if they remembered it the same way I did, but I could never bring myself to ask. What haunts me the most is the silence that followed. It wasn't just us who saw that thing. It was enormous, hovering over a densely populated suburb on a summer weekend night. Surely other people must have seen it, yet there was nothing. No news reports, no chatter at school, no stories in the paper. It was as if the entire event had been wiped from collective memory, leaving only the 3 of us with the fragments. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of it. Was it a government experiment, some kind of extraterrestrial encounter, a mass hallucination? None of the explanations fit. The idea that it might have been real, that others saw it and chose to forget, or were made to forget, scares me more than anything else. The possibility that I'm not alone in remembering, but that everyone else is too afraid to speak. I've considered hypnosis, wondering if it might help me recover more details, but the thought terrifies me. What if I uncover something I'm not ready to face? What if the gaps in my memory are there for a reason? I've lived with the mystery for so long that it's become a part of me, an unanswered question that I carry with me every day. I don't know why I'm writing this now, after all these years. Maybe it's the hope that someone else out there remembers, that someone will read this and say, "I saw it too." Or maybe I just need to finally let it out, to stop pretending it didn't happen. But one thing I know for sure, that night was real. The massive black craft, the glowing object, the trucks, they weren't a dream or a figment of my imagination. They happened, and somewhere out there, someone else remembers too. Redditor 5. The drive from Indiana University to my hometown was a stretch of road I knew by heart. It was a simple 2-hour trip, and I'd made it countless times before. That night, I left Bloomington around 10 p.m., aiming to get home just before midnight. The night was cold and clear, the kind where the stars feel sharper than usual, and the rural highways were quiet as always. By 10:53 p.m., I was on a long, empty stretch of 2-lane highway, flanked by fields and occasional clusters of trees. I was focused on the road ahead when I noticed flashing lights in my rearview mirror. My stomach sank. Great, a ticket. I slowed down and spotted a country road up ahead. Thinking it'd be safer to pull off there, I signaled and turned onto it, stopping my car a few yards in. I opened the glove box, rummaging for my registration and proof of insurance. But as I waited for the officer to approach, the flashing lights behind me suddenly disappeared. Confused, I looked back. There was no car, no officer. Just an empty road behind me, stretching into the dark. I sat there for a moment, baffled, before things got worse. My car's electronics started going haywire. The radio flipped through stations erratically, the volume rising and falling as if possessed. The dome light flickered overhead, and my headlights blinked off and on in a sporadic, unsettling pattern. My first thought was a failing battery, or maybe a short circuit in the electrical system. I leaned down to pop the hood, intending to check the battery. That's the last thing I remember. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was the night sky. The stars were impossibly bright, sharper than I'd ever seen them before, and the air was colder than it should have been. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Then the ground beneath me registered, uneven, cold, and littered with dry corn stalks. I sat up, disoriented, and realized I was lying in the middle of a harvested cornfield. Panic hit me like a punch to the gut. Where am I? How did I get here? Where is my car? I scanned my surroundings. The cornfield stretched out in all directions, a sea of dark stalks under the starlight. In the distance, I could see the faint glow of headlights from a road about half a mile away. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to piece together what had happened. The last thing I remembered was sitting in my car, but now I was here, alone in a field, with no sign of my vehicle. I forced myself to my feet and started walking toward the road. The cold air bit at my skin, and the crunch of the stalks under my boots was the only sound in the eerie stillness. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something. I didn't know what. The walk felt endless, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. When I finally reached the intersection, I saw the road signs, 350 N and 50 W. I knew this area. It wasn't far from where I'd turned off earlier. My car had to be close. Sure enough, as I walked along the main road, I spotted it. It was still parked where I'd left it, sitting in the faint glow of the moon. Relief flooded through me as I approached, but that relief quickly turned to confusion. The car was dark, completely dead. No interior lights, no headlights, nothing. I opened the door and sat down in the driver's seat, my breath visible in the chilly air. My phone was lying on the passenger seat where I'd left it. When I picked it up, the screen lit up and I saw the time, 2:17 a.m. Over 3 hours had passed. I sat there, staring at the glowing screen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. The last thing I remembered was looking at the clock in my car. It had been 10:56 p.m. How could it now be 2:17 a.m.? I'd only walked half a mile, which couldn't have taken more than 15 minutes. I glanced at the dashboard again. The battery was dead, which struck me as odd. The car had been running fine when I'd pulled over. It couldn't have drained that fast, could it? I tried to start the engine, but nothing happened. Not even the faint click of a struggling ignition. Sitting there in the silence, I felt a growing unease. Something had happened, something I couldn't explain, and the gaps in my memory felt like missing pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. After a while, I called AAA for a jump start. It took them about an hour to reach me, and during that time, I just sat there, staring out into the darkness. I tried to think through every possible explanation, but nothing added up. The flashing lights, the malfunctioning electronics, waking up in the field, it was like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. When the tow truck finally arrived, the driver didn't ask many questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. He got my car running again, and I drove home in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me like a heavy fog. I've told this story to exactly one person. My uncle. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally, but didn't offer much of a response. "Weird things happen," he said finally. "Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep." That was years ago, and I've kept the story to myself ever since. I've thought about hypnosis, wondering if it might help me recover the lost time, but the idea scares me. What if I uncover something I'm not ready to face? What if the gaps in my memory are protecting me from something I'm better off not knowing? Even now, I can't drive down that stretch of highway without feeling a knot in my stomach. Every time I see a flash of lights in my rearview mirror, my pulse quickens and my grip on the wheel tightens. I don't know what happened that night, and maybe I never will, but some nights, when I look up at the stars, I wonder if they hold the answers, or if they're just a reminder of how much we don't understand. Redditor 6. The drive back from my aunt's house that afternoon felt like any other. The sun was high in the sky, its warmth filtering through the car windows as the countryside blurred past. My mom and I were chatting about nothing in particular, the kind of casual conversation that flows naturally when you're close to someone. I was in the passenger seat, idly watching the landscape roll by, when something caught my eye. It appeared so suddenly that it was as if the sky had conjured it from thin air. Off to our left, hovering just above the horizon, was an object gleaming and unmistakably there. My breath hitched and I turned to my mom, but she had already seen it. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, her eyes darting between the road and the object. "What is that?" I said, my voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. She didn't answer right away, her expression mirroring the shock I felt. "I don't know," she finally said, her tone low and careful, as if speaking too loudly might scare it away. The object was massive. It had that classic saucer shape you see in old UFO documentaries, wide and flat with a slight dome on top. The sun glinted off its metallic surface, making it shine like polished silver. It wasn't far away, maybe a couple of miles, and it hung in the sky with an eerie stillness, as though the laws of physics didn't apply to it. There was no sound, no movement, no trail of exhaust or anything else to suggest it was man-made. It simply hovered there, unbothered by gravity. We continued driving, our eyes fixed on the craft, the road ahead an afterthought. It was hypnotic in a way, its presence both unsettling and fascinating. I remember feeling a strange mix of emotions, fear, wonder, curiosity, all tangled together in a knot in my chest. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it some new kind of military aircraft, a weather balloon, a trick of the light? But none of those explanations fit. It was too large, too solid, too deliberate in its stillness. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. I don't mean it flew away or faded into the distance. It simply wasn't there anymore. One moment it hung in the sky, gleaming in the sunlight, and the next it was gone, as though someone had flipped a switch and erased it from existence. My mom slammed on the brakes, the car jolting as she brought it to an abrupt stop on the side of the road. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, my heart pounding. It just disappeared. We sat there for a moment, staring at the empty sky where the craft had been, as if willing it to return. The air felt heavier somehow, the silence around us more profound. I looked over at my mom, and the expression on her face told me everything I needed to know. She had seen it too. Every detail, every impossible movement, every flash of sunlight on its surface. "What do you think it was?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head slowly, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I don't know, but it wasn't a plane, or a helicopter, or anything I've ever seen before." We eventually started driving again, but the atmosphere in the car had shifted. The easy conversation from earlier was gone, replaced by a lingering tension and 100 unspoken questions. The rest of the drive passed in a blur, and when we got home we sat in the driveway for a while, still trying to process what we'd witnessed. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the sighting. I replayed it over and over in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there wasn't one. The object defied everything I knew about how things moved and existed in the world. It didn't behave like any aircraft or natural phenomenon I'd ever heard of. And that disappearance, instant, total, and silent, was the part that stuck with me the most. My mom and I talked about it often in the weeks that followed, revisiting every detail to make sure we hadn't imagined it. We both described the same thing: the size, the shape, the way it gleamed in the sunlight, the impossible way it vanished. It wasn't like we could convince each other that it hadn't happened. We were both there, both witnesses to something we couldn't explain. As time went on, we shared the story with a few close friends and family members. Most of them laughed, dismissing it as a trick of the light or our imaginations running wild. "Probably a plane," they'd say, or "maybe it was a drone." But their laughter didn't bother me. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew my mom had seen it too. The experience sparked something in me, a fascination with UFOs and the possibility of extraterrestrial life. I started reading everything I could find on the subject, devouring books, articles, and documentaries. I learned about other sightings, some eerily similar to ours, and I wondered how many people had seen something they couldn't explain but were too afraid to speak up. Even now, years later, my mom and I still talk about that day. The details haven't faded with time, and the questions remain unanswered. What was it? Why was it there? And why did it vanish the way it did? I don't have the answers, and maybe I never will. But I know this much. What we saw wasn't a plane, or a helicopter, or a weather balloon. It was something else entirely, something extraordinary. And no matter how many people laugh or roll their eyes when I tell the story, it doesn't change the truth of what happened on that warm, sunny afternoon. We saw it, and I'll never forget it. Redditor 7. It was a warm, clear summer night in Germany, the kind of night where the sky seems impossibly vast, dotted with more stars than you'd think could ever fit in the darkness. I was stretched out on a rooftop, enjoying the solitude and the quiet. The air was cool against my skin, carrying the faint scent of nearby gardens and distant wood smoke. Nights like these always felt special, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something extraordinary. I was staring up at the stars, letting my mind wander, when I spotted a satellite. I'd seen plenty of them before, little white dots slowly tracing a path across the sky, steady and unremarkable. This one was no different at first. It moved in a constant direction at a constant speed, its faint glow blending in with the stars around it. I followed it lazily with my eyes, letting its predictable movement lull me into a sense of calm. And then it happened. The satellite, or what I thought was the satellite, suddenly changed direction. It didn't drift or arc gently like a plane or a falling star. It turned on a dime, a sharp, precise maneuver that seemed to defy the laws of physics. I blinked, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the light moved again, changing direction with the same impossible precision. I sat up, my pulse quickening, as I watched it trace a perfect isosceles triangle in the sky. It moved from one point to another, then another, its motion smooth and deliberate. There was no wobble, no hesitation, just sharp, exact movements, as if it were following an invisible blueprint. When it returned to the point where it had first changed direction, it paused for the briefest moment. And then it was gone. It didn't fade or vanish. It shot off at an incredible speed, far faster than it had been moving before. The steady, deliberate pace was replaced by a sudden burst of velocity, and it disappeared below the horizon in seconds. I stared after it, my mouth dry, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. For a few minutes, I sat there in stunned silence, replaying the moment in my head. The triangular pattern, the abrupt changes in direction, the sheer speed of its final movement. It didn't fit with anything I knew about the sky. I'd spent enough time watching satellites to know they don't move like that. And meteorites? They streak across the sky in straight lines, burning bright and fast. This wasn't that either. The next day, I told a friend about it. He'd been in Army intelligence and had a knack for explaining things I didn't understand. I described the movement, the triangle pattern, and the way it sped off into the distance. He listened carefully, his expression growing more serious as I spoke. "Satellites don't maneuver like that," he said finally. "Not even the military ones." "What about some kind of advanced tech, something experimental?" I asked, grasping at straws. He shook his head. "Even if they had something that could move like that, and I've never heard of anything like it, they wouldn't be testing it where civilians could see. Whatever you saw, it wasn't ours." His words sent a chill down my spine. "You think it was a UFO?" I asked, half joking, trying to lighten the mood. He didn't laugh. "If you mean an unidentified flying object, then yeah, that's exactly what it was." For days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that light tracing its perfect triangle in the sky, its movements precise and alien. I tried to come up with explanations. Maybe it was a drone or some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, or even a trick of my own perception. But none of them fit. Drones didn't exist in the mid-90s in the way they do now, and nothing about that light felt natural or random. I started reading about UFO sightings, looking for anything that matched what I'd seen. To my surprise, I found other accounts of similar movements. Sharp turns, triangular patterns, sudden bursts of speed. The details varied, but the essence was the same. Objects in The more I learned, the more questions I had. What was it doing up there? Why the triangular pattern? Was it scanning, observing, or something else entirely? And why had it chosen that moment, that place, to appear? I've shared the story a few times over the years, usually with close friends or fellow stargazers. The reactions are always mixed. Some people laugh it off, chalking it up to a trick of the light or an overactive imagination. Others get quiet, their eyes narrowing as they listen, and I can tell they've had their own experiences, their own moments of unexplained wonder. Even now, decades later, I still find myself looking up at the night sky, half hoping to see it again. Part of me wants answers, but another part of me wonders if I'm better off not knowing. There's something humbling about realizing how much we don't understand, how vast and mysterious the universe truly is. Whatever it was, satellite, UFO, or something else entirely, it left an impression on me that hasn't faded with time. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know this: it wasn't ordinary, it wasn't explainable, and it wasn't something I'll ever forget. Reddit. My dad has always been a no-nonsense kind of guy. He's not one for embellishments, tall tales, or fabrications. When he speaks, it's with purpose, and his stories have a weight to them that makes you believe them, whether you want to or not. Growing up, he would occasionally share stories about the strange things he experienced during his childhood in rural Illinois. His accounts weren't casual anecdotes. They were heavy with a sense of truth, even when they bordered on the unbelievable. He grew up in a small house near the woods, surrounded by sprawling farmland and the kind of deep quiet that only exists in remote areas. UFO sightings weren't just rare occurrences, they were part of the scenery. He and my grandpa would sit on the porch some nights, watching lights dart across the sky like they were stars with minds of their own. These weren't ordinary shooting stars or planes. They moved erratically, with sharp turns and impossible speeds, almost like laser pointers against the night. They didn't scare him. They were a curiosity, something to marvel at. But not everything about his childhood was so benign. One story always stood out. It happened when he was around 15, a warm summer day with the kind of still heat that made the air shimmer. My dad was alone, his parents off running errands, leaving him to his own devices. He was outside in the driveway, tinkering with something, or maybe just passing the time. Then, out of nowhere, a black car pulled into the driveway. Now, this wasn't just any car. It was sleek, perfectly polished, and completely silent. My dad would later describe it as unnerving, how the car made no noise, not the gravel crunching under the tires, not the hum of an engine. It just appeared, as if gliding over the ground. The windows were tinted, and the entire vehicle looked brand new, almost too perfect, like it had rolled straight out of a showroom. The door opened, and out stepped a man. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, with blonde hair and pale, flawless skin. His black suit was immaculately tailored, and he wore sunglasses even though the sunlight wasn't particularly harsh. My dad said the man looked off. Not in a monstrous or alien way, but in a way that was hard to pinpoint. Everything about him was too clean, too polished, too precise. His smile was wide and childlike, a fixed expression that felt more rehearsed than natural. The man approached my dad, his footsteps soundless, and greeted him in a voice that was overly friendly, almost giddy. "Is this your house?" he asked, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of curiosity that made my dad uneasy. "Yeah," my dad replied, already wary. "Why?" The man's grin widened. "I just have a few questions for you. Don't worry. I mean no harm." The conversation was strange from the start. The man asked if my dad had ever noticed anything unusual in the area. Lights, sounds, things that didn't seem to belong. My dad, who'd grown up with UFOs practically circling his backyard, said yes, but pressed for more information. "Why do you want to know?" he asked. The man's smile never wavered, but his answers were vague, dodging specifics. He seemed oddly excited to be having the conversation, his tone light and almost playful, as if he were a tourist asking for directions rather than someone probing about unexplained phenomena. My dad didn't feel threatened, but he did feel uneasy. The man's demeanor didn't match his appearance, and his questions felt too deliberate. Then, without warning, the man's smile disappeared. His expression shifted, his features tightening as though he'd just realized he'd made a mistake. He didn't say another word. He turned on his heel, walked back to the car and got in. The black car pulled out of the driveway just as silently as it had arrived, leaving my dad standing there, confused and unsettled. When his parents came home, he told them about the encounter. They listened, but there wasn't much they could do. Who was the man? What did he want? Why did he seem so interested in the strange things that had always surrounded their home? They didn't have answers, and life went on. The story might have faded into a strange family anecdote if not for what happened 30 years later. My mom, who had heard the tale countless times, was at a bookstore in another state, browsing through the shelves. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where nothing remarkable usually happens. She turned toward the cafe and froze. Sitting at a table not 30 feet away was a man. He was tall, blond, and impeccably dressed in a black suit. He was reading a newspaper, his posture relaxed, but there was something about him that made her heart race. He matched my dad's description perfectly. The flawless skin, the too clean demeanor, the sense of something being off. Next to him sat another man, dressed exactly the same. Black suit, black sunglasses, an air of precision that felt unnatural. My mom couldn't take her eyes off them. She wasn't prone to flights of fancy, but in that moment, she felt certain she was looking at the same man my dad had encountered decades earlier. The thought sent a chill through her. As if sensing her gaze, the blond man looked up. His expression changed instantly. He stood abruptly, folding the newspaper with mechanical efficiency, and walked out of the store, his companion following close behind. They moved quickly, their retreat almost rehearsed, and within moments they were gone. When my mom told my dad about the encounter, he went pale. They compared notes, and the similarities were undeniable. The same too perfect appearance, the same unnerving presence, the same abrupt departure when they realized they'd been missed. Growing up with these stories, I've had plenty of time to think about what they might mean. Were they government agents, aliens, something else entirely? My dad's experiences always seemed to center around UFO activity, but the presence of these men, if that's what they really were, added another layer to the mystery. Were they observing, monitoring, investigating? And why did they seem so interested in my dad and later my mom? I don't know if I'll ever encounter them myself. Part of me hopes I never do, but every now and then I catch myself scanning the crowd when I'm in a public place, looking for a tall blonde man in a black suit with a smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes. Redditor 9. The first time I ever saw anything I couldn't explain, I was 7 years old. It was in Houston, Texas, and I was lying on top of my mom's Suburban in the driveway, staring at the stars. That was my favorite thing to do back then, to just lie there and lose myself in the vastness of the night sky. It was a warm evening, and the stars were bright and clear. That's when I noticed it, an intensely bright light floating just above the tree line about half a mile away. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before. It hung there, glowing, silent, unmoving. I hollered for someone to come see it, but no one answered. I stayed there for a while, watching it, trying to understand what I was looking at, but it eventually disappeared, and life went on. I didn't see anything else for years after that. Not until March of 2008. That experience was unlike anything I could have prepared for. It was sometime between the 10th and the 15th, but I couldn't give you an exact date because I barely slept for 4 days afterward, trying to make sense of what had happened. I was in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where my mother lived in a garden home community. All the houses were the same size, one story, and the area had excellent visibility. It was around 4 a.m. when I walked out of my friend's house into a bright, starry night. The air was crisp, the kind of night where everything feels sharper. Something caught my eye to the left. I turned and saw it. A bright, strobing light, flashing blue, yellow, green, red, white, and orange in quick succession. It floated silently, moving slowly across the sky. I stood there in awe, unable to look away, afraid to run inside and grab someone because I didn't want to miss anything. As it passed in front of the moon, the outline of the craft became clear. It was teardrop-shaped, or maybe like a sunflower seed. The lights seemed to emanate from the top half, transmitting upward in a strange, almost hypnotic pattern. It had a thin, smooth line of dark exhaust that dissipated about 50 to 75 feet behind it. The The whole thing was no more than 400 yards away from me. After it passed behind my friend's house, I finally ran inside and got someone to come look, but by the time we got back outside, it had moved too far away to make out much detail. Still, I was shaken, my mind racing with questions. I went home, only a few blocks away, and stood in my driveway staring at the sky. I looked toward the direction the first craft had come from and saw two dim white lights slowly rising over the horizon, moving toward me at a leisurely pace. I ran inside and woke my mom. Together we stood in the driveway for 20 minutes, watching as 5 separate crafts passed over us. The first 2 came together, then another pair, and finally a single craft, each separated by 6 or 7 minutes. They moved silently at about 20 miles per hour, no more than 200 feet above us. From underneath, they were awe-inspiring, 2 massive white lights, each about 30 to 40 feet across, so bright it was hard to gauge their size precisely. Between the 2 white lights was a pulsating red light that dimmed and relit rhythmically. I estimated the crafts were each between 150 to 200 feet wide. When the last craft flew over, it was lower and slower than the rest. That's when I heard it. A sound that haunts me to this day. It was a loud, otherworldly noise, digital and metallic, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It let out the sound twice, each time reverberating through the still night air. I started crying, overwhelmed by the sheer strangeness of it all. Whatever piloted that craft knew we were watching. It felt like an acknowledgement, a kind of eerie greeting. A few weeks later, I had another experience that left me equally shaken. I was standing in my driveway late at night, smoking a cigarette and listening to my iPod. For some reason, I decided to pause the music and wave my hand over the screen, making a sort of strobe effect. That's when I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. I looked up, and directly above me, no more than 75 feet in the air, was a trapezoid-shaped craft with rounded edges. Its outline glowed with a pulsating red and black light, like flowing electricity. It hovered silently, moving side to side and front to back in smooth, deliberate motions, never straying more than 20 feet from its original position. I stood there, frozen, too fascinated and terrified to move. After 10 or 15 seconds, I gathered my courage and waved at it in a friendly gesture. The light pattern on the craft changed immediately, and it slowly hovered away behind my house. In hindsight, I think it wanted me to follow it, but I was too shaken to do anything but stand there and watch it go. I've seen that same craft 3 more times since then, once in Tuscaloosa, once in Hoover, and once in Bessemer. Each sighting was slightly different, but they all left me with the same sense of awe and confusion. One night in Tuscaloosa, I dreamed I was lying on something cold, with what felt like rubber straps around my legs and groin. The dream was vivid and unsettling, but when I woke up, I dismissed it as just a bad dream. That morning, I let the dog out and found a solid white ring in the grass near the patio, about 8 to 10 feet wide. When I showed it to my mom, she mentioned hearing a strange noise the night before but hadn't thought much of it. Another time, I heard a static-like sound, similar to a jet, and looked up to see a vertical blue slit in the sky above the community college near our neighborhood. It was about 200 yards long, with white electric currents sparking off its edges. As I watched, 25 small white objects shot out of the slit one by one, leaving glowing trails behind them. When the last object had passed, the slit closed with a strange, resonant sound and vanished. These experiences have left me with more questions than answers. I've started researching phenomena like this, learning about contactees, people who, unlike abductees, seem to be kept up with by whatever or whoever is behind these encounters. I don't know why I've had so many experiences, but I can't deny the pattern. It's both a gift and a curse, leaving me grateful for the insight but frustrated by the lack of understanding. I've only shared a fraction of what I've seen and felt, but every experience has shaped my life in ways I'm still trying to comprehend. If these stories help someone else feel less alone, then maybe sharing them was worth it. Redditor 10. It's hard to know where to begin when recounting experiences like these. For most of my life, I tried to make sense of them, and for a long time, I talked openly about them to anyone who would listen. But that openness came with a cost. Over time, I learned that sharing these stories often brought skepticism, ridicule, and judgment. Even so, the more I spoke about these experiences, the more they seemed to happen, as if my willingness to engage with them invited more encounters. One of the most profound experiences happened with a guy named Adam. We'd been hanging out late one night, around 3 or 4 a.m., after leaving a friend's apartment. It was a typical night for that period of my life where I'd sleep until the afternoon and spend the late hours awake and restless. Adam and I sat in his driveway, smoking and chatting, when suddenly, an intensely bright light appeared over the hill less than a mile from his house. The light was so brilliant and otherworldly that it immediately grabbed our attention. We both stared at it, entranced. I started scanning the area, wondering if there was something else we were missing, and that's when I looked up. Directly above us, 2 orbs floated silently in the night sky, pivoting around each other in a strange, deliberate motion. I pointed them out to Adam, and we both stood there, captivated. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bright light over the hill was some kind of test, a way for whatever was behind it to gauge our reaction. I told Adam as much, and we both impulsively waved at the orbs. What happened next was beyond anything I'd ever experienced. The sky came alive. Dozens of orbs, at least 3 dozen, appeared seemingly out of nowhere, darting and weaving in every direction. Streaks of light shot over the horizon, one after another, like fireworks, but with precision and purpose. It wasn't random. It felt orchestrated, intentional, almost like a performance. The sheer number of lights, the intricate patterns they formed, and the overwhelming sense of connection I felt in that moment, it was beyond explanation. Another time I was sitting on a friend's back porch. He lived near me and we often talked about these topics, sharing our fascination with the unexplained. That night, as we sat there, a bright light appeared in the distance. It was maybe a couple of 100 yards away, drifting slowly across the sky. It moved silently, with an orange glow that grew in intensity as it floated by. The light became so bright that we couldn't look directly at it. After a few seconds, it began to fade, disappearing into the darkness. My friend and I just stared at each other, speechless, both in awe of what we had just seen. That wasn't the last time it happened. We saw the same light a couple more times, once even on request. It was one of those moments where I felt bold, cocky even. A few friends who hadn't witnessed anything didn't believe our stories, so I said, "You want to see a UFO? Come over here." I don't know what made me so confident, but I led them to the same porch where the first sighting had happened. Sure enough, the light appeared again. It followed the same pattern, brightening to an almost unbearable intensity before fading out. I've always wondered if my acknowledgement of these phenomena somehow encourages them to reveal themselves. After the first major experience with the 5 crafts, I dove into research. I was desperate for answers, some kind of framework to understand what was happening to me. That's when I stumbled across the Raelian belief, a concept tied to intelligent design. It proposed that extraterrestrials had seeded human life on Earth through genetic manipulation, and that humanity, in turn, would one day do the same for other planets. The theory aligned closely with the ancient astronaut hypothesis, suggesting that ETs had been involved in shaping human civilization for millennia. The Raelian belief, as I understood it, began with a man named Raoul, who claimed to have encountered a UFO in the 1970s. According to his story, a craft landed near him and a small humanoid ET emerged. This being explained that all the major religions were based on misinterpretations of ancient encounters with extraterrestrials. It suggested that figures like Ezekiel, Moses, and other prophets had been influenced by ETs through thought implantation to instill spiritual beliefs in humanity. I'm not saying I believe this, but the connections it drew between religious narratives and extraterrestrial encounters were intriguing. The more I thought about it, the more it resonated with my own experiences. I couldn't ignore the strange correlation between my willingness to share these stories and the increase in encounters. It was as if the act of acknowledging these phenomena, of speaking them into existence, strengthened their presence in my life. Over time, I began to piece together my own theories. Maybe these experiences were part of something larger, something tied to our understanding of the universe and our place in it. Maybe the orbs, the crafts, the streaks of light, they weren't just random occurrences but deliberate attempts at communication. I started to see them not as intrusions but as invitations to explore something beyond the limits of my comprehension. Despite the awe and fascination these experiences have brought me, they've also been isolating. People mock what they don't understand, and sharing these stories often feels like walking a tightrope between curiosity and ridicule. Yet I can't stop thinking about them. The more I try to make sense of it all, the more I realize how little we truly know about the world around us. I've considered writing everything down, compiling these stories into a book, if only to have a record of what I've experienced. Maybe someone else will find meaning in them, or maybe they'll just serve as a reminder that there's still so much about our universe that remains a mystery. For now, I continue to watch the skies, waiting for the next encounter, knowing that whatever happens, it will leave me both humbled and hungry for answers.